Welcome everyone to our first Wednesday series. My name is Frankie Lill. I'm an aviculturist here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, which is just a fancy word for zookeeper for birds, where I primarily work with our aquatic bird and amphibian collection. Thank you so much for joining us here in this Pacific Visions Theater this evening, and to all of those of you that are watching online. We'd like to thank our sponsors for helping to make this program possible. Courtyard by Marriott Long Beach Downtown Hotel, Stephen and Brenda Olson, Ralph and Hazel Osborne, and Lois J. Rourke Charitable Trust. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Caroline Cappello, will be presenting on Galapagos and Magellanic penguins and how they serve as indicators of environmental change. Dr. Cappello is a wildlife researcher and conservationist specializing in the ecology and conservation of penguins. When not in the office, she can be found boating along coasts of the Galápagos Islands in search of breeding Galapagos penguins, or living with over 200,000 Magellanic penguins in their colony at Punta Tombo, Argentina. She received her PhD from the University of Washington and is currently a postdoctoral researcher with the Arizona Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Arizona. Following her presentation, there will be a 15-minute Q&A with the audience, then a cocktail and social hour with crafts and music, and will take place in our Pacific Visions Art Gallery. You will also have the opportunity to adopt a penguin this evening as a special holiday gift for yourself or your friends and family, and all proceeds help to support our conservation efforts and conservation education here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. Please silence your cell phones and welcome Dr. Cappello.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a weeknight to learn a little bit about penguins. These animals are really near and dear to my heart, and so I'm super excited to be here and share with you some of what I've learned working with penguins over the last 9 years. Before I begin, I really want to emphasize that this work that I'll share today is highly collaborative. I did this work with the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels at the University of Washington, which is run by Dr. Dee Boersma, and continue to collaborate with colleagues there on ongoing projects. We also have incredible collaborators in Argentina and in Ecuador, particularly in Galapagos National Park and in the provincial government of Chubut, Argentina. And we really couldn't do this work without them. We also couldn't do this work without generous donors, large and small. These projects that I'm going to talk about tonight are long-term projects, some of which span over 50 years. And so that really takes a village in terms of funding, and it really couldn't be possible without family foundations, NGOs, and individual donors. So if I were to walk into a room and ask people to close their eyes and picture a penguin, where is it? What does its surroundings look like? What is the climate like? I think a lot of people would arrive at an image that looks something like this. It's penguins huddled together in a cold place. They're standing on ice. They're standing near snow. This looks like Antarctica. And a quick Google search last week sort of confirmed that idea for me. I just typed the word penguin into Google and took a screenshot of the top 3 rows. And so, yeah, there's a lot of white in these pictures. There's a lot of snow, a lot of ice, a lot of penguins that look like, we've got emperor penguins, king penguins. But there are 18 species of penguin on the planet, and they're actually pretty broadly distributed across the southern hemisphere. So if you ever find yourself in a coastal temperate forest along the coast of New Zealand, you may find yourself eye to eye with a Tawaki or Fiordland penguin. If you ever find yourself in Melbourne, Australia, you could run across a couple little blue penguins standing on rocks and seemingly taking in the city lights. On a hot, sunny day in Cape Town, South Africa, you may head to the beach and find yourself amongst a colony of African penguins. And if you ever find yourself on coastal islands off the coast of Chile, you might find yourself looking at a Humboldt penguin perched inside of a cactus. So this is just to illustrate that penguins live in a variety of habitats, and they're really adapted to a variety of environments. And the two types of penguins that I specialize in, the Magellanic penguin and Galapagos penguin, I think are two species that sort of fall into this category of the unexpected penguin. They don't live on ice, they don't live on snow. And so today my goals are really to introduce you to these two birds, tell you a little bit about where they live and how they make a living, give you a brief overview of the types of research questions I ask about these birds and the types of questions my colleagues ask. And a recurring theme that will come up through this talk will be the importance of long-term studies and the opportunities provided by long-term studies. I'll go back there. Also try to touch on some of the conservation efforts that are in way for these birds, some of the challenges for conservation and some of the opportunities. And before I dive into I did not mean to make a penguin pun just there, but before I dive into descriptions of these species, I wanted to highlight another reason why scientists are so eager to study penguins. And that is because penguins serve as really excellent indicators of ecosystem functioning and ocean health. So this is important because we know our planet is changing, we know our oceans are changing, but it can be really challenging for us to understand what's happening out at sea, which is where we can look for species like penguins that are accessible to us, measurable by us, but can tell us a lot about what's happening in the ocean. So these penguins spend most of their lives at sea. That's where their food is, that's where they forage, they migrate, they spend their non-breeding seasons at sea. But they have to return to land to lay eggs. And they frequently do this at the same time, at the same place, year after year after year. And so that predictability of where they'll be and when makes it relatively easy for a researcher to access them and observe them on land while learning a lot about what's happening in the water. So if a colony of penguins returns to land very skinny, we know there's something going on with their food supply at sea. If they return to land coated in oil or with plastic in their stomachs, we know we have a problem with marine pollution. And so through these observations, we not only learn about the ecology of our changing world, but we can also hopefully design some conservation measures that will protect not only penguins, but entire ocean ecosystems. And so a lot of my work with penguins sort of views them through this lens where we ask not only what does our research tell us about penguins, but what do penguins tell us about the environment? So our first penguin that I'll talk about today is the Magellanic penguin. This is a South American seabird that breeds along the coasts of Chile and Argentina. And it spends its non-breeding time off the coasts of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil. And I'll be speaking about a specific colony today called Punta Tombo, which is on the Atlantic coast of Argentina. Punta Tombo is a dry, windy, coastal habitat that's really characterized by drought-resistant plants like pampas grass and low-lying bushes that have lots of spikes and spines. Magellanic penguins share this space with a lot of other really fascinating wildlife. There are elephant seals and sea lions along the coasts. There are guanacos, which are a relative of llamas, and lots of smaller mammals like armadillos, skunks, foxes, and wildcats. And then there are terrestrial birds that range from as small as sparrows and wrens, going all the way up to this rhea, which is a relative of the ostrich. And there's also a host of seabirds that breed at Punta Tombo as well. There are cormorant colonies, gull colonies, and terns. So each year, about 200,000 pairs of penguins, Magellanic penguins, return to Punta Tombo to breed. They'll lay one clutch of 2 eggs. You can see the size of these eggs next to a Sharpie here. They'll lay one clutch, either in a burrow that they themselves dig into the soil, or underneath one of those spiky, spiny bushes. And so by putting their eggs underground or under bushes and rearing their chicks there, that protects them from inclement weather and some of their predators, like gulls that would fly over and eat an exposed egg. So here you can see a busy hill of penguins standing outside of their burrows, going to and from the ocean, bringing food back for their chicks. And we know a lot about this particular colony because the Boersma Lab at the University of Washington has been studying this colony since 1982. And almost every year since 1982, students, staff, researchers, and volunteers have lived in the penguin colony for 5 to 7 months of the year through that breeding season, following the lives of these individuals. Over the course of the study, the project has banded over 60,000 individual penguins with a stainless steel band that rests on their upper flipper. And we've collected over 1.5 million rows of data, following the reproductive success of their nests, following penguins' movements at sea, their food sources, their behavior, and much, much more. And so this data set is pretty rare in terms of how long-term the data set is, and also in terms of how detailed it is. And scientists can really use this data set to ask questions from as small as looking at genetic material to understand aging in penguins, scaling all the way up to multinational conservation questions. I was fortunate enough to live in the penguin colony for 6 to 12 weeks every year from 2014 to 2018, during which time I measured and weighed many penguins. I dove headfirst into many spiky bushes looking for eggs and looking for chicks. Got a few bites in the process, so if you want to see any of my penguin scars later at the cocktail hour, you can ask. And during this time, I also developed the questions for my research and contributed to this long-term data set. And something that we do know that's happening at Punta Tombo is that it is a colony in decline. It has declined over 40% over the last 40 years. So whereas this used to be considered the largest colony of Magellanic penguins on the planet, as of a couple years ago, it no longer has that ranking. And we don't know exactly why it's declining this rapidly. Part of that could be that penguins are actually just moving to other colonies that are now closer to good food sources. It could be that survival over the winter is low due to competition with fisheries or adults and juveniles getting caught in fishing nets. And it also could be in part because of changes that are happening at the colony that impact chick survival and impact juvenile survival. And these changes at the colony are something that I became very interested in over the last few years, particularly in looking at the changes in timing of important life events for these birds, so events like migration and breeding. And what we've seen over the course of the study is that penguins are returning later to the colony from their spring migration, and they're subsequently laying their eggs later. So egg laying now happens about 9 days later than it did in the 1980s. We've been able to link this delay in breeding to unfavorable ocean conditions in their winter range that likely makes it harder for them to find food, takes longer for them to bulk up and really get ready to breed. And so that delays the start of their migration, delays their arrival, and then delays breeding. And I've been really interested in trying to unpack some of the consequences of that shift. It's possible that that's a really adaptive shift. It's enabling them to sort of change their behavior with climate change in order to persist and thrive in the wild. Or it could have negative effects later in the breeding season that impact chick survival that I was really curious to sort of address. And so the first thing, we looked at this a number of ways, and I'm just going to share a few of the highlights from this work. We first looked to see if hatching dates were also getting later. We knew eggs were getting later, so it seemed like hatching would probably be getting later as well, and it did. So here we have our year on the x-axis and our hatch date on the y-axis, and we found that, yes, hatching dates have gone about 10 days later than they were in the 1980s. When we then looked at fledge dates, which for Magellanic penguins, fledging means it's the day that a chick leaves its nest and goes to the ocean for the first time. And at that point, it's completely independent from its parents. It receives no further meals, it receives no further protection. And when we looked at those fledging dates over time, we did not see that same trend, which really surprised us and meant that with hatching dates getting later and fledging dates staying the same, that nestling duration, or the number of days that chicks were spending in their nests, receiving meals from their parents, growing their feet, growing their flippers, that period decreased by about 14%. And so these later hatched chicks were fledging about 6, 7, 8 days younger than their earlier hatched peers. So we immediately had some predictions as to what the trade-offs would be for fledging younger. We predicted that chicks that fledged younger would fledge smaller because they've spent fewer days in their nest growing. We predicted that they would fledge skinnier because they haven't had as many of those good last meals. And when we looked at a group of over 500 chicks where we knew their age when they fledged and we knew their size when they fledged, we found that in particular their bills, both in terms of how tall the bills were, the vertical depth of their bill, and the length of their bill, that was substantially smaller in these younger chicks. And the bill size could be really important for these chicks at sea because the penguin's bill is basically a set of tweezers that they use to pluck their food out of the water. That's how they eat. And so if you have a smaller bill, you might not be able to catch as large prey, so there are fewer prey or less diversity of prey that are available to you. So when we looked at the survival of smaller chicks over the course of that first perilous year at sea, we did find that those smaller chicks are less likely to survive and return to the colony as juveniles or adults. And so for us, this was a sort of interesting cascading effect where you had an environmental change in their winter range that led to a behavioral change in their breeding range, but it didn't trickle through the whole season. There was a point at fledging where that delay stopped. When taken together, the nestling duration decreased, and those younger fledglings left the colony with smaller bills. And in turn, smaller fledglings were less likely to return to the colony. So this is sort of just a piece of the puzzle to the changes at the colony. None of what I'll present today is the smoking gun for why the colony has declined so much. But our team is sort of chipping away at all these pieces, trying to understand and kind of put together this complete picture of what's happening at Punta Tombo. This delay in breeding is not the only climate change impact that we're concerned about at the colony. With climate change, extreme weather events like heat waves and large rainstorms are predicted to become more common. And we've already seen the devastating effect that an extreme heat wave can have at Punta Tombo. In 2019, graduate student Katie Holt and Dee Boersma documented an unprecedented heat event at Punta Tombo where during the day in the shade, the temperature got up to 111 degrees Fahrenheit. And over the course of those few days, over 250 adults died from heat stress, and over 60 chicks died as well. And this was not something that had ever been seen in the 40 years that our project has been in the colony, and was certainly a really worrying event, and is additive to other causes of death in the colony. On the other side, we are also concerned about large rainstorms. When chicks are young, they don't have waterproof feathers yet. They just have their fuzzy chick down. And when they get wet, it's sort of like when you're out in a down coat and you get rained on. That down coat stops keeping you warm. And so this is what happens to penguin chicks when they're exposed to rain at a young age, and they can become hypothermic and not survive. And so with rainstorms becoming more common, researchers Dee Boersma and Ginger Rebstock did find that these chicks were more vulnerable to death by these rainstorms. And again, that's an additional cause of death on top of starvation and predation that they already face. And so these are things that we're worried about, and also examples of changes at the colony that we really wouldn't be able to pick up on if it hadn't been for this long-term study. We wouldn't know that the timing of breeding has shifted, and without sort of having boots on the ground in the colony, it would be very easy to miss these extreme events like that heat wave in 2019. So this can feel pretty disheartening at times. And especially considering that there isn't a lot that our team can do on a day-to-day basis to alter the trajectory of global climate change. So that's where we look for other actions that we take, other problems that we can help solve for these birds that will just give them a little boost to survival or a boost to reproductive success, help them as much as we can as they face this changing environment. And so I want to share a story that predates my time with the project, but I think is a really inspiring story and really motivates me in my work as a conservation biologist. And so in the 1980s and early 1990s, oil pollution was a known problem along the coast of Argentina. Every year, hundreds of seabirds and penguins would be found on shore dead, coated in oil. And this wasn't from a single catastrophic oil spill. It was from lower levels of chronic oil pollution that were discharged from oil tankers as they transited the coast, bringing petroleum from port to port. In 1994, a research team estimated that each year on the Argentine coast, 40,000 Magellanic penguins were being killed by oil pollution, by this low-lying chronic oil pollution. And so this is something that was documented by scientists, documented by veterinarians at rehabilitation centers, and became a real object of public interest. Journalists picked it up, and people were really demanding a change. At the same time, there were national NGOs and conservation organizations in the country working to develop recommendations to provide to the government. And eventually there was that political will, and the government used those recommendations to make a change. In 1994, the provincial government of Chubut, which is the province that Punta Tombo is a part of, passed a law moving those tanker lanes 40 kilometers further offshore. So I'll show that here on a map. It's kind of a fuzzy map, but this shows where the tanker lanes were moving in 1995, and this red line shows where the tanker lanes were moving in 2000. And what that did is it didn't remove oil pollution or didn't stop oil pollution, but it reduced that spatial overlap between where the penguins and other seabirds were foraging and transiting, reduced that overlap with where the oil tankers were moving. And so each year since that change, at Punta Tombo, our team goes out and we survey the beaches looking for oiled birds and doing a survey. And about every 5 years, Dee Boersma and our collaborator, Esteban Frere, go out and hike miles and drive miles and miles along the full Chubut coast doing the same thing, looking for oiled birds. And the really exciting outcome of this is that it has basically been reduced to zero. I myself have never seen an oiled bird at Punta Tombo ever. And in March 2022, when Dee and Esteban went out and surveyed the full Chubut coast, they also found 0 oiled seabirds and penguins. And so this was an example of, I think, kind of an amazing example of there being the science to document a problem, political or public will to have it change, an NGO having the connections and ability to provide these recommendations to the government, and the government taking an action. And this certainly doesn't mean that there isn't oil pollution elsewhere in the world. Oil pollution is still an active threat for seabirds and penguins. But to me, this is a really amazing example of actions that humans can take to have a drastic difference, to make a drastic difference for wildlife. I'm going to take a sip of water and let you watch this video of penguins swimming. So for this second part of the talk, I'm going to switch gear and bring us over from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean to think about these rather unexpected penguins, the Galapagos penguin, which is the northernmost penguin on the planet, and it is the only penguin that breeds north of the equator. It breeds just barely into the northern hemisphere. The Galapagos Islands are a volcanic archipelago that are about 500 miles off the coast of continental South America, and it is a province of the country of Ecuador. The islands are made up of inactive and active volcanoes, so on any given trip, you might have the privilege of seeing a volcanic eruption from a safe distance. This is a photo that I took in 2018 of Sierra Negra erupting. And these eruptions create the foundation of these islands, and let me go back. The foundation of these islands, and so walking around you can see these massive lava fields that spread for miles and miles and miles. Dotting the coast of these islands are smaller islets that are old lava tufts and lava cones that are sort of crumbling back into the sea, and that makes really excellent habitat for penguins and other seabirds. But these aren't barren islands. They're home to many plant species, including grasses and cacti and several species of mangrove. Galapagos is also home to a richly biodiverse fauna. It has high levels of endemism, which means that there are animals here that exist only in Galapagos. So that includes the Galapagos sea lion, the Galapagos fur seal, the Galapagos marine iguana, which is pictured here. These iguanas can grow to about this long and are the only iguanas in the world that swim out to sea, dive below the water, and scrape algae off of the rocks below the surface with their teeth for their food. Galapagos is also home to several finch species, which are collectively referred to as Darwin's finches, due to their, in part, helping inspire Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. And then there's also wildlife in Galapagos that are not endemic to the islands. They do exist elsewhere, but they're pretty characteristic of the islands, such as these blue-footed boobies. So you may be asking why these volcanic islands in the middle of the ocean have such high biodiversity, and the answer really lies with the ocean currents. And one current in particular that I want to mention is the Cromwell Current, which sweeps across the Pacific Ocean from Asia and Oceania, across the ocean on the equator, and pretty much hits Galapagos straight on. And this current is a cold water current that's very nutrient rich, but it's about 300 feet below the surface of the water. But what happens when the current hits Galapagos is that just the topography of the islands shoves the water, pushes that cold, nutrient-rich water up to the surface, where it's now in the same zone where the sunlight can hit. And so that mixture of nutrients and sunlight allows for the phytoplankton and algal blooms that really form the base of that marine food chain and allow all these wildlife to thrive in the islands. And of course, the star of the show today is the Galapagos penguin, which is endemic to the islands, so it only exists in Galapagos, and they're resident to the islands, so they're there year-round. They don't migrate like the Magellanic penguins do. Galapagos penguins are listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. This is because they have a small population. The last estimated that there were somewhere between 1,500 and 4,700 individuals total. They have a restricted geographic range, existing only in Galapagos. And they face ongoing threats such as overfishing, predation by introduced mammals like cats and rats and dogs, and the big one being their exposure to severe El Niños. And El Niño, La Niña, these may be terms that you're familiar with. They are climatic events that can impact weather patterns worldwide. But the climate of Galapagos is particularly directly linked to El Niño, La Niña cycles. So during an El Niño, the water surrounding Galapagos, denoted here by that black star, the waters surrounding Galapagos become very warm and nutrient poor, and there's very little food available for marine animals. And so during a strong El Nino, you may see reproductive failure amongst the sea lions, the fur seals, and the seabirds. And during very strong El Ninos, you can even see mass mortality events of adults who don't find enough food. This photo was taken on a trip that I took to Galapagos in 2016 during an El Nino, where a lot of the penguins were looking like this bird. They were skinny, their feathers were brown and brittle, and they were coated in a layer of algae that to us sort of implied that these penguins were spending a lot of time in the water looking for food and a lot less time out on water, or out of the water, drying their feathers in the sun, cleaning their feathers, and keeping their feathers in good condition. The current population of Galapagos penguins is thought to be about half of what it was in the 1970s, and this is due to mass mortality events associated with strong El Ninos in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. And because the frequency of severe El Ninos is expected to increase with climate change, these birds are one of 3 penguin species considered most at risk for extinction. And so a lot of our work with Galapagos penguins is really to provide information to Galapagos National Park that will enable them to manage this population and try to protect them as well as other marine predators. And so our research goals with these birds are to estimate their survival rates. What's the likelihood that an adult or a juvenile will survive from one year to the next? What's the probability if it's an El Nino? What if it's a La Nina? What if we have this management action in place? There's no fishing allowed in this area versus there is fishing allowed in this area. So estimating survival rates. We want to determine chick survival rates as well by checking nests. We want to determine the penguin's body condition by weighing and measuring them. We can determine if they're skinny, if they're fat, and that can give us some information about the food supply in Galapagos. We want to identify emerging threats quickly so that we can act if we can. And we want to test management strategies to see what are the tools that we have available to us. What can Galapagos National Park do moving into the future? So to do this, Dee Boersma started a new project on Galapagos penguins in 2010 with our primary collaborator in Galapagos, Godfrey Merlin, and members of Galapagos National Park. And I joined this project in 2015. And every 6 months, we travel to Galapagos and live aboard this research vessel, whose name is Ratty. And we buzz along the coast looking for penguins, searching for nests, and trying to capture as many penguins as we can so that we can get that sense of their body condition. And when we have them in hand, we'll also tag them with a small stainless steel tag in the webbing between their 2 toes. And that enables us to estimate survival so that if we come back on another trip and find the same bird with the same tag, we know that it's still alive. This is not always a very easy thing to do. As I mentioned earlier, these birds are very rare. There may be as few as 1,500 individuals total. And they're really dispersed across their breeding range. They don't nest in dense colonies like other penguins and a lot of other seabirds do. Instead, they're sort of dispersed along the coast in nests that are inside of lava tubes, lava tunnels, and in little cracks and crevices in the rocks. And so boating by from the water, they can be really invisible if they're in their nest. They also live in remote areas. It takes us about 30 hours by boat to get to our first field site. So the logistics of these trips are challenging, and the penguins, they don't tend to help us out very much. But just to give you a picture of what this looks like, so once we've reached our study sites, we'll hop into our wooden dinghy, and we'll go along the shore looking for little dots on the rocks that look like they could be penguins. And if it looks like we can approach those rocks, we'll hop on shore, we'll try to capture the bird if we can, so that we can weigh it, measure it, tag it, and then release it. And we'll also search to see if it has a nest nearby. A lot of the times our trips look more like this, where we have a pair of penguins up high on these lava rocks, And we're sitting in our dinghy watching this swell come in and then drop rapidly. And we're looking at how slippery those rocks are, how coated in barnacles they are. And so in a case like this, we'll count the penguins. We'll try to determine if they're an adult or a juvenile based on their feathers. And then we'll move on. We won't try to search for a nest or capture them. If we do find ourselves in a position where we think we can grab the penguins, the swell is low, the wind is in our favor, so here's a big group of penguins on the rock. We're very excited. We'll try to catch them either with a net or this steel hook. But that's us just hitting a rock. And now we're stuck on a rock. And that's all the penguins needed to see to decide, I'm going for a swim. So this is just to illustrate that it's challenging to catch these penguins, and we'll really bust our butts down there for a couple weeks and usually catch between 30 and 60 penguins, which is generally enough to get a sense of their body condition and to try to estimate survival. But certainly we know that it's very likely that on any given trip, there are birds that are out there with those tags on that are still alive, and we just don't see them. And so that's where we use quantitative tools and models back at the lab in Seattle to try and estimate survival, given that we know we don't perfectly catch every bird. And so this was an analysis that we did last year that shows their survival from 2011 to 2022. And what I really wanted to just highlight in this figure is that dip in survival does coincide with that El Nino that I mentioned earlier when the penguins all looked like this. So we were able to see that signal of the El Nino impacting not just reproductive success, but also this adult survival. And so again, just like with the Magellanic penguins, we find ourselves in this position where there's not much we can do day to day to alter the trajectory of global climate change, and we need to look for other solutions, other management practices that could just help these penguins, help boost their survival or boost their reproductive success as they face these environmental changes. And one thing that we know is a problem in Galapagos is that there are introduced predators on many of the islands. And these feral cats and dogs and rats will eat eggs, they'll eat chicks, and they can kill adults. And so this likely really limits the areas that penguins can put their nests, because there are now many islands where it's not safe to nest. We also know that some of the best penguin habitat that is still predator-free is eroding. Just by natural processes, those rocks are tumbling back into the sea. And so in thinking about this nest site limitation, where can these penguins nest safely, that seemed like a problem we could try to tackle with human action. And so in 2010, the project, in collaboration with Burr Henneman and Galapagos National Park, built 120 semi-artificial nests on 4 islands, or 4 sites in the islands, either by excavating lava into sort of little lava tunnels, or by stacking plate lava or stacking lava rocks into these penguin houses. And basically, we're trying to test, one, whether penguins will use constructed nests or use artificial nests. How long will these nests last on their own? What kinds of nests do the penguins prefer? And in doing so, we're hoping that we find that in times when food conditions are really good in the islands and the penguins are fat and healthy and ready to breed, that they all have a safe, shady place where they can lay their eggs and raise their chicks. And so every 6 months when we visit the islands, we check every natural nest we know of, we search for new natural nests, and we also check these constructed nests. And the sort of quick and dirty results from this project are that, yes, the penguins will use these nests. We have seen pairs acting territorial inside these nests. We've seen penguins incubating eggs. We've seen them brooding tiny chicks. We've also seen penguins move into these nests as little as 6 months after they were built. So we'll build a nest in one trip, come back the next, and there's a penguin inside. So that lets us know that the penguins are, actively, they're looking around, prospecting, looking for nests. And we've also now seen penguins use the same nests over and over. This nest in the corner here is our most popular nest, and basically every time we go, there's a new layer of guano caked to the outside. There's often a bird inside, or birds acting territorial. And so this has been a really exciting sort of conservation success, exciting results. It seems like this could be a good tool for Galapagos National Park moving forward. And you may be noticing that all these rocks look kind of similar, these nests look similar, and that is because these are all nests at one site. And I had mentioned earlier that we built the nests at 4 different sites. And so at first we thought, okay, they're just not interested in them, they don't know about the nests at the other sites, they haven't found them, they're not interested in them. Until 2021, when we came back for the first time after quarantine and found a pair of penguins in this artificial nest at Punta Espinosa. So this is now a nest at a new site that's in use. And when we returned in February 2022, that same pair was inside and they were incubating eggs. And there were 3 other nests at that site that also had penguin guano inside or penguin nesting material like sticks and grasses. And so in total, let's see. Here we go. In total, 21 of the constructed nests have been used by penguins, and they've been used a total of 47 times. This makes up 28% of all active nests that we've been able to find since 2011. So again, these numbers may look kind of small, but for a rare endangered species, we're really excited by these results and really encouraged that this could be a viable management solution long term. So my next steps for this project are to now try to answer that question of what types of nests do the penguins prefer. So we've been measuring the opening of these nests, measuring how deep the nests are. We've been putting temperature loggers inside that measure the temperature throughout the day so we can see how much it fluctuates inside the nests. And by doing this, we hope that we can kind of hone in on what is that perfect nest, what's the nest that a penguin is most likely to move into. As we continue this project, we'll continue to try to estimate survival, estimate reproductive success, and find ways to link penguin condition to their environment. And in doing so, hopefully, again, providing information to Galapagos National Park that can help them help these animals thrive. And before I finish for the night, I just wanted to throw up a quote about shifting baselines, which is something that it's a concept that I think about a lot in my work in Galapagos, which was first talked about for fishery scientists in 1995 by Daniel Pauly. And it says, we'll just step back here. This shifting baseline syndrome has arisen because each generation of fishery scientists accepts as a baseline the stock size and species composition that occurred at the beginning of their careers and uses this to evaluate changes. When the next generation starts its career, the stocks have further declined, but it is the stocks at that time that serve as a new baseline. The result, obviously, is a gradual shift of the baseline, a gradual accommodation of the creeping disappearance of resource species, and an inappropriate reference for evaluating losses resulting from overfishing or for identifying targets for rehabilitation measures. And the reason that I think about this a lot with my work in Galapagos is that I have the great privilege of working with 2 researchers that have either lived or worked in Galapagos since 1970. And so especially when I first started going down there, when I would see a scene like this, where blue-footed boobies are diving from the sky and tuna and Sierra mackerel are sort of whipping up the forage fish, the small sardines, into a ball that the boobies are diving on, the pelicans are coming in, the penguins are coming in, and I would see this and I would turn to them and say, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And they would agree, they'd say yes. But this feeding frenzy only lasted for 10 minutes, and it only had less than 100 individuals participating. 50 years ago, a feeding frenzy like this could have lasted from dawn to dusk and have hundreds of individuals participating. And so to me, those moments tell me how much that baseline has already shifted, how much Galapagos has already lost, and how much it still could lose. And in those moments, I also feel really grateful to be part of this long-term research program with generations of scientists that can sort of help me understand how a better picture of what wild and thriving Galapagos looked like 50 years ago. And it also makes me think about the future and think about 30 years from now, 40 years from now, if I'm lucky enough to be on a boat in Galapagos teaching the next generation of scientists about that special place, and someone says, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I think about what my response will be. Will I say, it is, but I really wish you could have seen it 30 years ago? Or will I also be able to point to the actions taken by policymakers, by scientists, past and present, by educators and passionate people all over the world? Will I be able to sort of point to the actions that we've done, the actions that we've taken, and yeah, know that we made a difference for these animals and know that we kept that baseline from shifting even further. So that's what inspires me in my work, and hopefully inspires some food for thought for the rest of you as well. So with that, thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm very happy to answer questions.
Wow, thank you so much. That was amazing. I sat here thinking about what I'm going to say, and I have to admit, I've never thought about the other animals that live near penguins. So when you posted the armadillo and the ostrich-like bird, what was it called?
The rhea.
Rhea, I should know that. I didn't even ever cross my mind that other animals live there, so that was really wonderful. And there's more, of course. But at this time, we're going to have some questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We've got some folks coming up and down the stairs. I know that we've for sure got a few, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi. What is the lifespan of both of those species that you discussed this evening?
Great question. And a question that Frankie can also answer from the aquarium perspective. The oldest banded penguin at Punta Tombo that we know of is 33 years old. And the oldest breeding penguin we've known of was 28. So they basically breed until they die. Their eggs just get slightly smaller as they age. And Galapagos penguins, that's more of an open question. We don't really know. We think it may be about 10 years that they typically live, but our oldest Galapagos penguin that we know of, I believe, was 14 years old.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being here and for your amazing presentation. My question is, what are some ways that the general public can help contribute to the conservation effort, aside from adopting a penguin? Are there other ways that we can get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of things people can do from large to small. I mean, I think my first answer is always, vote for people that prioritize environmental issues, and yeah. and give money to companies that take environmental change seriously as well. On an individual level, always using less is better, reducing waste in your life, reducing single-use plastic use. And then, if you have time, energy to spare, if you have funds to spare, finding an organization that you're passionate about and donate what you can to them.
Yeah, I know the conference on biodiversity is, I think, occurring right now. And I know that there have been some changes in the Biden administration trying to address it sort of in advance of the conference. My question is, do you know what kinds of things that we're doing? I mean, one of the reasons I ask this question is that my understanding of biodiversity is it's cellular biodiversity, this very small critters that are kind of more critical than the big ones, but the big ones get attention because they're cute.
Yes.
So, yeah, do you know what the United States has done and whether there is, or other countries or, that are really doing more for the biodiversity of smaller critters?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I'm going to have a great answer to it. A lot of what I interact with in my field is thinking about the Endangered Species Act and the protections and funds that are made available through those listing decisions, which is also why estimating survival for these penguins, making those models can be really useful, because it can inform listing decisions, which then inform where the money needs to go, and helps policymakers make tough decisions about how to allocate resources. And then I also am aware of sort of regulations within fisheries in terms of where in Galapagos, in Argentina and worldwide, where it's acceptable to take fish out of the ocean, how much is a sustainable yield, and trying to figure out sort of how to leave. I believe the thinking is leave a third. They say a third for the birds, so leaving a third of forage fish in the ocean for wildlife. But based on shifting baselines, what is a third of the fish? Where does that baseline start? I'm sure they do know. If you read the paper, they have a baseline for you. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and sharing everything that you've been doing. I was wondering if you could share any information on management actions to address the introduced predators.
Yes. Thank you for asking about that. There is an incredible effort underway to remove invasive predators from Galapagos, which is removing goats and rats and cats and dogs. And there have been huge successes. NGOs like Island Conservation, working with Galapagos Conservancy, working with Galapagos National Park, there have been several large islands now that they've removed all of the goats from. That was, flying over in helicopters and doing really amazing feats from the air, removing those predators. They've removed rats from some of the smaller islands, and that's an ongoing project. There was a huge push in the year 2000 called Project Isabella. That was when they got the goats off of some of those islands. And there's also more local stakeholders as well that are organizing to keep cats and dogs spayed and neutered, and helping sort of change human behaviors so that feral animals aren't released again into the islands.
Hi, sorry. Just had a question. You said I don't know what year it was, they moved it out 40 was there any research on what other potential animals are now, like dolphins or any of the rest of the marine layer with that move?
That's a great question, and I think that's sort of the natural follow-up question of, well, but who's using that space of the ocean? And I think that the answer there is that there are patches of the coast on the Patagonia continental shelf that are really good foraging areas, and then there are areas that just don't sort of have the right topography or ocean currents to be very productive, and so there are fewer animals there that are foraging and using that space. But certainly this chronic oil pollution is still a problem, and I'm sure there are animals that are still impacted by those oil tanker lanes, but it seems like they've been moved to spaces that are less used by the animals.
Yeah, and I just had a follow-up question. I see you guys are doing metal tagging. Mm-hmm. I mean, especially with this smaller Galapagos Island population, and it's hard to catch them with the volcanic stuff. Isn't there technology now? I mean, small little chips, something that you could actually scan from a distance?
Yes.
It could be introduced.
Yeah, that's a great thought. There are those chips, and we do actually, I sort of presented one tag type, but we are using those chips more and more. For us, we still have to they're about the size of a grain of rice. It's like what people have put in their dogs and cats at the vet, and will insert them into their ankle, and they'll stay there for life. But the range on them is still not very long, and so we basically still have to be within a foot of them to read it. Which means that at Punta Tombo, when they're in their burrow, you can stick your arm in with the sort of magic wand reader and read that tag without pulling the bird out of the nest. But for the Galapagos penguins, we haven't figured out yet a way to get that signal far enough away.
Hey, thank you so much for your research and for the wonderful presentation. I was curious, you touched really briefly, I think, on fisheries impacts to the Magellanic penguins. And I was curious, what are the main impacts, whether it's bycatch or competition for forage fish, and what kind of management stuff is going on for those guys?
Yeah, great question. So it can be hard to disentangle what is competition for food and what is entanglement in nests, because that both of those decrease the population. It's happening at sea where we can't observe it. But researchers along the coast of Brazil and Argentina are thinking more and more that bycatch is a really large issue for Magellanic penguins that has been historically really underreported. There's a scientist and veterinarian in Brazil that has sort of determined what it looks like to heal necropsy penguins when they come in, dead penguins when they come in, and he has sort of figured out how to tell if a penguin has drowned due to a fishing net. They don't always have the fishing net still on them, and he thinks that there's just a lot more of that happening than we know of. And so that's something that's sort of an emerging question for a lot of researchers. How do we get more information about that, and what can we do about that? And same thing in Galapagos. There's control of the levels of fishing within the Galapagos Marine Reserve, but right outside of the Marine Reserve, there are a lot of fishing vessels, large fishing vessels that camp out there year-round. I think that was in the New York Times a few months ago, and so that could really be depleting fish stock in Galapagos, even though it's happening in international waters where the Ecuadorian government can't intervene. And so, yeah. That's a long answer, but yeah, big problem and a lot that needs to be done nationally to fix it, internationally.
Yeah, again, thank you for a great lecture. Your shifting bias syndrome is really interesting because it points out the problems of the transfer of knowledge. You know, researchers work for 20, 30 years in the field. Politicians work from election to election. Different thinking cycle. So the more you can compact the information into little tidbits to get the attention of an elected official before they go off to their next, fundraising golf tournament, the better. And that's a very powerful tool, I think, to present that information.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And then we'll just have one last question, and then we'll wrap up. And if you have more questions, we'll have some time at cocktail hour.
Hi. I noticed in your presentation that both types of penguins had 2 eggs. And I know in the Galapagos there's a type of a booby that has siblicide, so that only one of the eggs survived. Have you observed anything like that, or is it usually both eggs survive?
In Magellanic and Galapagos penguins, I don't know of any examples of siblicide. Certainly there can be nests where only one chick survives, and that's just a matter of how much food were the parents able to bring back, or did a predator get into the nest. There are other species of penguins, the rockhopper penguin, for example, they lay 2 eggs, but one is extremely small. There's sort of like one normal-sized egg and one more ping-pong ball-sized egg. And I believe that that second egg just basically never hatches and is some lingering evolution. It was 2 eggs, and then evolution has pushed towards no, invest in just 1 egg, but they haven't completely lost that second egg yet. And then emperor penguins only lay 1 egg, so there's, yeah, some range among the penguins. But I don't know of Siblicide. Thank
Alrighty.
you so much.
Now, I would like to please welcome you all for cocktails, conversation, paint a fish, and a crafts in our art gallery. Please make sure that you exit at the bottom of the PV Theater. You can exit out of whichever doorway. Stop by the bar with your ticket to receive a complimentary holiday drink, cocktail, or mocktail. Our next First Wednesday will be in the new year on January 4th, and will feature The Humanity of Wolves with Dr. Steve Wastel and Paula Ficara from the Apex Project. They will discuss the importance of connecting people to wolves on an emotional level while sharing biological and ecological facts about this essential keystone species. Thank you for joining us here tonight. Happy holidays, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was awesome. Good job.
Hey.